At my father's funeral, my stepmother read a will that left me nothing. The family nodded in agreement. Then I pulled out a document that changed everything. The lawyer's voice echoed through the church basement, where we'd gathered after burying my father. To my beloved wife, Vivian, I leave the entirety of my estate, including the family home, all financial assets, and my business holdings. I watched my stepmother's face carefully arranged into grief, though her eyes held something else entirely, something that looked like victory. My Aunt Carol nodded solemnly. My Uncle Richard murmured agreement. Even my younger half-sister Bethany seemed unsurprised, her hand resting on Vivian's shoulder in comfort. The lawyer, a man I'd never met before named Gerald Timmons, continued reading from a document I hadn't been allowed to review. My son Nathan has been provided for adequately throughout his life and requires no further provision. My stomach dropped through the floor. 28 years of being my father's only child for the first decade of his life, of building his construction company alongside him every summer since I was 16, of being promised that legacy, erased in a single sentence read by a stranger in a church basement that smelled like coffee and old hymnals. I'd been working at Fletcher Construction for 12 years, the last 5 as operations manager, believing I was learning to run the family business I'd someday inherit. My father, Thomas Fletcher, built that company from nothing starting in 1985. By the time I graduated college in 2019, Fletcher Construction employed 83 people and had contracts worth millions across 3 states. Dad had suffered his first heart attack when I was 23, and that's when the promises started. "This is yours someday, Nate," he'd say, walking me through the office, introducing me to clients as the future of Fletcher Construction. When he married Vivian 3 years ago, just 18 months after my mother's death from cancer, I told myself it was grief, loneliness, the fear of dying alone. Vivian was 41 to his 62, attractive in a calculated way, with perfect blonde hair and a smile that never quite reached her eyes. She worked as his executive assistant, a position she'd held for less than 8 months before the wedding. My friends said I should be suspicious. My girlfriend at the time, Natalie, practically begged me to get my father to update his will, to protect what was rightfully mine. I'd brushed them all off, confident that blood was thicker than 3 years of marriage. Now, sitting in that church basement surrounded by people who'd known my father for decades, I realized I'd been catastrophically wrong. Gerald Timmons folded the will and looked at me with something like pity. "Mr. Fletcher, if you have any questions about the document, you're welcome to review it with your own legal counsel." His tone suggested I'd be wasting my time. I found my voice, though it came out rougher than I intended. "When was this will executed?" 11 months ago, Timmons replied. "On March 15th, 2025, witnessed by 2 individuals unrelated to the family, completely legally sound." My father had been in the hospital 11 months ago for his second heart attack. He'd been weak, medicated, barely able to recognize me some days. I'd spent every evening there, holding his hand, reading him updates about the business, promising him everything would be fine. And apparently, while I was doing that, Vivian had convinced him to rewrite his will and cut me out entirely. Aunt Carol leaned forward, her expression sympathetic but resigned. "Nathan, honey, your father made his choice. Vivian was his wife, and she took care of him at the end. You have to respect his wishes." I stared at her. This was the same woman who'd helped raise me after my mother died, who'd promised she'd always look out for me. Now she was nodding along with my disinheritance like it made perfect sense. "I'd like to see the original document," I said, my hands clenching into fists under the table. Timmons exchanged a glance with Vivian. She dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, playing the grieving widow to perfection. "Of course you're upset, Nathan," she said, her voice thick with manufactured emotion. "But your father was very clear about his intentions. He felt you'd established your own career, your own life. The business needs someone who can dedicate themselves to it fully, and at this stage in my life, I'm prepared to do that." The implication hung in the air. I wasn't dedicated enough, wasn't committed enough, wasn't worthy enough. I bit back the rage threatening to explode out of my chest and forced myself to stay calm. "I'll be in touch with my attorney," I said, standing up. The metal folding chair scraped against the linoleum floor. "This isn't over." Vivian's mask slipped for just a moment, and I saw genuine irritation flash across her face before she smoothed it away. "Nathan, don't make this harder than it needs to be. Your father wouldn't want you causing trouble." I walked out before I said something I'd regret, past the coffee urns and sympathy cards, past my cousins who wouldn't meet my eyes, out into the parking lot where the October air felt sharp enough to cut. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get my key in the car door. I drove to my apartment in a daze, my mind replaying every conversation I'd had with my father over the past year. He'd been different after marrying Vivian, more distant, but I'd attributed that to his declining health. He'd stopped asking me to Sunday dinners, stopped calling to discuss business decisions, started CCing Vivian on emails that used to be just between us. I'd noticed but hadn't fought it, thinking I was being respectful of his new marriage, giving them space. Now I understood I'd been systematically pushed out while I was too polite to push back. At home, I pulled out every document I had related to Fletcher Construction. My employment contract, emails from my father, letters he'd written me over the years. In a box in my closet, I found something I'd almost forgotten about. A handwritten letter from my father dated June 2021, just before he married Vivian. Nathan, it read in his distinctive scrawl, I know you worry about what happens to the company when I'm gone. I want you to know that Fletcher Construction is yours. I built it for you, to give you the kind of security and legacy I never had. No matter what changes in my personal life, this business is your birthright. I've made arrangements to ensure that. Trust that I'll always put you first. Love, Dad. I stared at those words until they blurred. I've made arrangements to ensure that. What arrangements? Where was the will that reflected this promise? The next morning, I called every attorney in town until I found one willing to see me immediately. Lawrence Brennan operated out of a converted house downtown, his office filled with law books and family photos. He was in his 50s, with gray hair and the kind of steady presence that made you feel like your problems might actually be solvable. Mr. Fletcher, he said, shaking my hand firmly. I'm sorry for your loss. Tell me what's going on. I explained everything. The funeral, the will, my years at the company, my father's promises, Vivian's sudden appearance in our lives, the letter I'd found. Lawrence listened without interrupting, taking notes on a legal pad. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and studied me. The first thing we need to establish is whether this will you heard read at the funeral is legitimate. You mentioned your father had a previous will? He must have. He told me multiple times the company was mine. He wouldn't have left everything to chance. Do you know who his previous attorney was? I thought back. Catherine Grayson. She handled all his business stuff for years. I met her a few times. Lawrence wrote down the name. Good. I'll reach out to her office and see what we can find. In the meantime, I need you to gather everything you can. Employment records, emails, any written communication from your father about the business or his estate plans. If we're going to challenge this will, we'll need to show either that your father lacked capacity when he signed it, that he was unduly influenced, or that it contradicts clearly expressed prior wishes. Over the next week, I became obsessed. I showed up to work at Fletcher Construction every day, even though Vivian had already announced herself as the new CEO and was treating me like a low-level employee instead of the operations manager who'd kept the company running while my father was sick. She scheduled a staff meeting without telling me, rearranged my office assignments, started reviewing my decisions and overriding them. I documented everything, forwarding emails to my personal account, keeping records of every slight and every change. On Thursday, I got an email from Lawrence. Call me when you can. Found something interesting. I stepped outside the office and dialed his number. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. Nathan. Lawrence's voice was excited in a controlled, lawyerly way. I spoke with Catherine Grayson. Your father did have a previous will with her office, executed in 2020, which left the business to you and split other assets between you and any future spouse. That will was never formally revoked. But Timmons said the new will supersedes it. Normally, yes. But here's where it gets interesting. Catherine said your father contacted her office 8 months ago, asking about the process for challenging a will on the grounds of undue influence. He wanted to know what protections existed if someone was being coerced into making estate decisions against their better judgment. My breath caught. He knew. He knew what she was doing. It appears he suspected something. Catherine scheduled a meeting with him to discuss it, but he canceled at the last minute. She followed up several times, but he never rescheduled. That was January of this year. I thought back to January. My father had been particularly withdrawn then, barely speaking to me when I visited. Vivian had been hovering constantly, answering questions on his behalf, insisting he needed rest whenever I tried to have a private conversation with him. I'd assumed she was being protective. Now I understood she'd been controlling access, preventing him from undoing whatever she'd manipulated him into doing. What can we do with this information? I asked. It establishes a pattern. Your father was concerned about undue influence right around the time this new will was created. Combined with his medical records showing cognitive decline and heavy medication, we might have grounds to challenge. But Nathan, I need you to understand something. Will contests are difficult, expensive, and often ugly. If we pursue this, we're looking at potentially years of litigation. I don't care. This isn't about the money. This is about my father's legacy and what he actually wanted. Then we move forward. But I need more. I need witnesses who can testify to your father's true wishes, to Vivian's behavior, to his mental state when the second will was signed. Can you find people willing to go on record? I thought about the employees at Fletcher Construction, people who'd worked with my father for decades, about his friends, his doctors, anyone who'd witnessed the change after Vivian entered the picture. I'll find them. Finding people willing to testify proved harder than I expected. I started with Alan Kowalski, the company's head foreman who'd worked with my father for 26 years. We met at a diner outside town where I knew we wouldn't be overheard. Alan was in his 50s, weathered from years of construction work, with kind eyes and a direct way of speaking. Your dad loved you, Nathan, Alan said after I explained what was happening. He talked about you constantly, how proud he was that you'd joined the business, how you had better ideas than he did about modernizing our processes. This will business doesn't make any sense. Will you testify to that if we challenge it? Alan's face fell. Kid, I want to help you. But Vivian's already made it clear that anyone who sides with you will be out of a job. I've got 2 kids in college and a mortgage. I can't risk it. I felt that familiar rage building again. She's threatening people? Not directly, but the message is clear. She called me into her office yesterday, asked if I thought you were handling your grief well. Said she was concerned you might become disruptive to the business and that she'd need to know if anyone was enabling that behavior. What am I supposed to think that means? I talked to 6 more employees over the next few days. Every single one gave me some version of the same answer. They believed me, they thought the situation was wrong, but they couldn't afford to lose their jobs. Vivian had successfully intimidated them into silence. My half-sister Bethany called me on a Friday evening. She was 19, a sophomore at State University, and had always looked up to me when she was younger. We'd grown more distant after Vivian and my father married, but I'd attributed that to her being a teenager busy with her own life. Nathan, she said, her voice tight and strange. We need to talk. Can you meet me somewhere Mom won't know about? That she called Vivian Mom still felt like a small betrayal, even though I knew it was natural. I met her at a coffee shop near campus. Bethany looked terrible, with dark circles under her eyes and a nervous energy that had her shredding her napkin into tiny pieces. What's going on? I asked. She glanced around like she expected Vivian to materialize from thin air. I wasn't supposed to be there, but I heard Mom on the phone about 6 weeks before Dad died. She was in his study, talking to someone about the will. I only caught part of it. But Nathan, she was laughing. She said something like, of course he signed it. He was so doped up on pain medication he probably doesn't even remember. The lawyer I found won't ask questions as long as the check clears. My hands went numb. Why didn't you tell me this at the funeral? I didn't want to believe it. I thought maybe I misunderstood. Maybe it was about something else. But watching you at the reading, seeing how shocked you were, I realized she'd actually done it. She manipulated Dad into cutting you out. Will you testify? Will you tell my lawyer what you heard? Bethany's eyes filled with tears. I can't. Nathan, I'm sorry, but I can't. She's still my mother and she controls my college fund. If I go against her, she'll cut me off. I'll have to drop out. She's stealing from our father's legacy, from both of us. I know, but what am I supposed to do? I'm 19. I don't have any money of my own. I'm trapped. I wanted to be angry at her, but I couldn't. She was just a kid caught in the middle of something ugly. Is there anything you can do? Anything that wouldn't directly implicate you? She thought for a moment, still shredding that napkin. There might be recordings. Dad's study has a security system with cameras and audio. It was installed 2 years ago after that break-in attempt in the neighborhood. I don't know if Mom knows about it or if she deleted anything, but if those files still exist somewhere, they might have captured conversations. Hope flared in my chest. Can you get access to the system? The main computer is in Dad's study. Mom's cleared out most of his stuff, but the security system runs on its own server in the basement. If I can get into the house when she's not there, maybe I can pull the backup files. When? She has that charity gala tomorrow night. The one for the children's hospital. She'll be gone for hours. I can say I'm coming home to grab some stuff from my room. The next night felt like the longest of my life. I sat in my apartment with my phone in my hand, waiting for Bethany's call, running through every possible disaster scenario. What if Vivian came home early? What if the files were password protected? What if they'd been erased? At 9:23 p.m., my phone buzzed. I'm in the basement, Bethany whispered. The server is here, but I don't know how to access the files. It's asking for login credentials. I'd been researching security systems all day in preparation for this. Look for a model number on the unit. Text it to me. She sent a photo. I recognized the system, a commercial-grade setup my father had installed through a company we'd worked with on several projects. I knew the default admin credentials for that model because we'd recommended it to clients. Try username, admin, password, SecureView 2023, all one word, capital S and V. Silence. Then, I'm in. Oh my God, Nathan, there are thousands of files here, audio recordings going back 2 years. Can you download them to a flash drive? I brought one, but this is going to take a while. There's so much data. Take everything from the last 18 months. That covers the period after Dad got sick through when the new will was signed. I heard typing, the click of a mouse. Bethany's breathing was quick and shallow. It's downloading. Estimated time is 35 minutes. Every minute of those 35 minutes felt like an hour. I paced my apartment, imagining every way this could go wrong. Finally, at 10:08 p.m., Bethany called back. I got it. I'm leaving now. Where should I meet you? Not anywhere near your campus or my apartment. Somewhere public. We met at a 24-hour diner on the highway, the kind of place where nobody paid attention to anyone else. Bethany handed me a flash drive with shaking hands. I haven't listened to any of it. I don't think I want to know what's on there. Thank you. This took real courage. Nathan, promise me something. If this proves what we think it proves, promise me you'll make sure she faces real consequences. Not just losing the will contest. Real consequences for what she did to Dad. I promised. That night, I delivered the flash drive to Lawrence Brennan's house. He answered the door in sweatpants and a t-shirt, looking annoyed until he saw my face. "This better be good, Nathan. It's almost 11. It's evidence. Audio recordings from my father's home security system, covering the period when the new will was created." Lawrence's expression changed instantly. He ushered me inside, and we spent the next 3 hours listening to files on his laptop. What we heard was damning beyond anything I'd imagined. There were recordings of Vivian on the phone with Gerald Timmons, the lawyer who'd read the will at the funeral. "He's barely coherent half the time," Vivian's voice said on a file dated March 10th, 2025. "When he's lucid, he still talks about leaving the business to Nathan. We need to move quickly while he's still weak enough to sign without too many questions." Timmons's voice replied, "I'll prepare the documents. But Vivian, if he's that impaired, we could have problems down the line. A challenge based on lack of capacity could succeed. Then we make sure the witnesses see him on a good day. I'll schedule it for right after his medication wears off when he's most alert. He'll be tired but cognizant enough to appear competent." There were recordings of Vivian intercepting phone calls meant for my father, telling people he was too sick for visitors, isolating him systematically. There was a conversation between Vivian and someone named Lydia Marsden where Vivian laughed about how easy it was to manipulate a sick old man desperate not to die alone. And most damning of all, there was a recording from March 14th, 2025, the day before the will was signed. Vivian's voice, cold and calculating, speaking to someone I didn't recognize. "Tomorrow, everything changes. Once the will is signed, the company is mine. I've already got buyers lined up. We'll sell off the assets, liquidate what we can, and walk away with at least $15 million. Maybe more if Nathan doesn't fight it." The other voice asked, "What about Thomas? Won't he notice what's happening?" Vivian laughed. "He'll be dead within 6 months, according to his doctors. And even if he lives longer, I'll make sure he's too medicated to interfere." Lawrence stopped the recording and stared at me. "This is conspiracy to commit fraud, possibly elder abuse. Nathan, we're not just looking at a will contest anymore. This is criminal." My father had died 7 months after that recording, almost exactly on Vivian's predicted timeline. The official cause was heart failure, a natural progression of his condition. But listening to her casually discuss his death like it was a business opportunity made me physically ill. "What do we do?" I asked. "We take this to the police. Tonight." Detective Raymond Cross was a 20-year veteran of the fraud division, a tall man with silver hair and an expression that suggested he'd seen every scam imaginable. We met him at the police station at 1:30 a.m., and he listened to the recordings without comment, taking notes in a neat, precise hand. When the last file finished playing, he sat back and whistled softly. "Mr. Fletcher, this is one of the most clear-cut cases of estate fraud I've seen. Your stepmother essentially confessed to the entire scheme on tape. The question is whether she knew about the security system." "I don't think so," I said. "My father had it installed while she was traveling for work. She wasn't involved in the decision." "Good. That means these recordings are legally obtained and admissible. We'll need the original files, not just copies, to establish chain of custody. Can your sister provide access to the security system?" "She already risked everything getting us this flash drive. I don't want to put her in more danger." Detective Cross leaned forward. "Mr. Fletcher, I understand your concern, but if we're going to build a criminal case, we need to do this properly. We'll get a warrant for the security system based on these recordings. Your sister won't have to be directly involved. We'll execute the warrant and seize the equipment as evidence." "How long will that take?" "Given the severity of what I've heard, I can have a judge sign off on this by Monday morning. We'll execute the warrant Monday afternoon." That gave Vivian roughly 65 hours before her world came crashing down. Detective Cross must have seen something in my expression because he added, "Don't do anything stupid. Don't confront her. Don't tip her off. Don't give her any reason to suspect you know about this. We've got her dead to rights, but only if she doesn't destroy evidence before we can secure it." I spent the weekend in a state of barely controlled anxiety. Vivian called me Sunday afternoon, her voice syrupy with false concern. "Nathan, I know the will situation has been difficult for you. I thought we might have lunch this week to discuss your future with the company. I don't want there to be bad blood between us." The audacity was breathtaking. She'd stolen everything from me and was now playing the gracious victor, offering me scraps. "I'll check my schedule and get back to you," I said, keeping my voice neutral. "Please do. Family is important, Nathan. Your father would want us to get along." Monday morning, Detective Cross called. "We've got the warrant. Team is assembling now. We'll execute at the Fletcher residence at 2 p.m. I wanted to give you a heads up in case you want to be present." "I'll be there." I arrived at my father's house at 1:45 p.m., parking down the street where I could watch without being obvious. The house I'd grown up in looked different now, like Vivian had already started erasing my father's presence. The garden my mother had planted was torn up, replaced with modern landscaping that had no personality. The front door had been repainted a color my father would have hated. At exactly 2 p.m., 3 police vehicles pulled up. Detective Cross led a team of 4 officers to the front door. I moved closer, my heart hammering. Vivian answered, looking annoyed, her expression changing rapidly to alarm as Cross showed her the warrant. "This is outrageous. I heard her say, her voice shrill. What possible grounds do you have for searching my home? Ma'am, the warrant outlines the specific evidence we're here to collect. I'd advise you to step aside and let us do our job. I watched through the window as they headed to the basement. Vivian followed, her face pale, her hands shaking. She knew. In that moment, she knew exactly what they were going to find. The security team removed the entire server setup, documenting everything, bagging evidence with the precision of people who'd done this 1,000 times. Vivian stood in the corner of her living room, her phone pressed to her ear, almost certainly calling Gerald Timmons. When the police left, I called Lawrence. They've got the evidence. What happens now? Detective Cross will analyze the files, build his case, and present it to the district attorney. If the DA agrees there's enough for criminal charges, and based on what we've heard, they absolutely will, Vivian will be arrested and charged. The will contest becomes almost secondary at that point because she won't have any credibility. How long? Criminal investigations can take time. Weeks, possibly months. I don't have months. She's running the company into the ground. She's already started laying people off, changing supplier contracts, making decisions that benefit her short-term but destroy what my father built. Lawrence was quiet for a moment. Then we need to force her hand. We file the will contest now, immediately, with the audio recordings as evidence. We request an emergency injunction preventing her from making major business decisions until the estate matter is resolved. It won't stop the criminal investigation, but it might save the company. We filed the next morning. The petition was 46 pages long, detailing every piece of evidence we'd collected. The audio recordings were attached as exhibits, transcribed and time-stamped. We requested the court invalidate the March 2025 will, restore the previous will that left the business to me, and immediately suspend Vivian's authority over Fletcher Construction pending resolution of the case. The hearing for the emergency injunction was scheduled for Friday, 4 days away. In those 4 days, Vivian went into full warfare mode. She held a press conference announcing that I was contesting my father's will out of greed and disrespect for his final wishes. She gave interviews painting herself as the devoted wife who'd sacrificed everything to care for a dying man, now being persecuted by his ungrateful son. She hired Margaret Kensington, the most aggressive litigation attorney in the state, a woman known for destroying opponents through any means necessary. But she didn't know we had the recordings. Detective Cross had kept that detail quiet, not wanting to compromise the criminal investigation. So when we walked into that courtroom on Friday, Vivian thought she was prepared for a standard will contest. She had no idea she was walking into an ambush. Judge Diana Livingstone presided, a stern woman in her 60s with a reputation for not tolerating nonsense. The courtroom was packed with family members, company employees who'd taken time off to attend, and several reporters who'd gotten wind of the case. Lawrence stood and addressed the court. Your Honor, this is not a typical will contest based on interpretation or family disagreement. This is a case of systematic fraud, elder abuse, and criminal manipulation. We have evidence that will demonstrate beyond any doubt that the decedent was coerced into signing a will that contradicted his clearly expressed wishes, and that the beneficiary of that will engaged in conspiracy to defraud the estate. Margaret Kensington rose, her expression confident. Your Honor, these are serious allegations made without substantial proof. My client is a grieving widow being subjected to harassment by a bitter stepson who feels entitled to money that isn't his. Then let's hear the proof, Judge Livingston said, gesturing to Lawrence. Lawrence presented the audio files. We'd edited them into a devastating 20-minute compilation that told the entire story. Vivian plotting with Timmons, Vivian discussing my father's impending death like a business transaction, Vivian explicitly stating her plan to sell the company after manipulating the will. The courtroom was silent, except for those voices, cold and calculating, destroying any pretense of innocence. I watched Vivian's face drain of color. I watched Margaret Kensington's confidence evaporate as she realized her client had lied to her about everything. I watched family members who'd nodded along at the funeral now staring at Vivian with horror and disgust. When the recording ended, Judge Livingstone looked at Vivian with an expression of pure contempt. Mrs. Fletcher, I am immediately granting the emergency injunction. You are hereby suspended from any authority over Fletcher Construction pending full resolution of this matter. Furthermore, I am referring this case to the District Attorney's Office for criminal investigation, though I understand they may already be involved. Vivian stood, her composure completely shattered. Your Honor, those recordings were obtained illegally. My stepson broke into my home and stole private. The recordings were made by a security system your husband installed in his own home, Lawrence interrupted. There was no break-in, no illegal search. The evidence is completely admissible. Your Honor, I move for an immediate dismissal of this emergency petition. Kensington tried. Motion denied, Judge Livingstone said firmly. In fact, based on what I've heard today, I'm inclined to invalidate the March 2025 will immediately and restore the previous will dated 2020. However, I'll allow both parties to submit additional arguments before making that final determination. This hearing is adjourned. The courtroom erupted. Reporters surged toward Vivian, shouting questions. Family members backed away from her like she was radioactive. Aunt Carol, who'd been so sympathetic to Vivian at the funeral, looked at me with tears streaming down her face. Nathan, I'm so sorry. I didn't know. None of us knew. I accepted her apology, but I'd remember who had stood by Vivian without question and who had demanded proof. The next 72 hours were chaos. News of the recordings spread through our social circle and business community. Fletcher construction employees who'd been too scared to testify before suddenly came forward, eager to distance themselves from Vivian and pledge loyalty to me. Clients called to express support and relief that I'd be taking over the company. Detective Cross called on Monday morning. We're making the arrest today. I wanted you to hear it from me first. What are the charges? Conspiracy to commit fraud, forgery. We found evidence she forged your father's signature on several documents, elder abuse, and we're looking at potentially adding wrongful death. That last one hit me like a punch. You think she killed him? The medical examiner is reviewing his records. Your father's death was ruled natural causes, but given that Vivian had a financial motive and predicted the timing so accurately, we need to make sure there wasn't foul play. It could take weeks to get results, but it's being investigated. Vivian was arrested at 3 p.m. at her attorney's office. The perp walk made the evening news. I watched her on television, hands cuffed behind her back, her carefully constructed image completely destroyed. They set bail at $500,000, which she made by liquidating assets she no longer had any right to. Gerald Timmons was arrested the following day on conspiracy charges. His law license was immediately suspended pending the outcome of the criminal case. The state bar launched an ethics investigation that would likely end his career regardless of the criminal verdict. 2 weeks after the arrests, Judge Livingstone issued her final ruling on the will contest. The March 2025 will was invalidated. The 2020 will was restored. Fletcher Construction, along with all other estate assets, would be distributed according to my father's actual wishes. The business to me, other assets split between me and Vivian as his widow, with Vivian receiving roughly 30% of the non-business estate value, a fair settlement for a 3-year marriage under normal circumstances. Vivian's attorney filed an appeal, but legal experts I consulted said it had virtually no chance of success. The evidence was too overwhelming, the fraud too blatant. The criminal trial was scheduled for the following spring. Prosecutors offered Vivian a plea deal: plead guilty to fraud and elder abuse, serve 8 years in prison, pay full restitution. She refused, apparently believing she could convince a jury that she'd been the victim of a conspiracy. Margaret Kensington withdrew as her counsel, citing irreconcilable differences. The medical examiner's report on my father's death came back 3 months later. While they couldn't prove murder, they found evidence that his medications had been improperly administered during his final weeks, potentially hastening his death. The dosages didn't match what his doctors had prescribed, and several medications that should have been in his system weren't detectable. Someone had been controlling what medications he received, either giving him too much of some things or withholding others entirely. The district attorney added a new charge: criminally negligent homicide. I took over Fletcher Construction officially in January 2026. My first act as CEO was to restore the employment contracts of everyone Vivian had laid off or threatened. My second was to reverse every destructive decision she'd made during her brief tenure. Alan Kowalski, the foreman who'd been too scared to testify initially, became my right-hand man. We rebuilt trust with clients, strengthened relationships with suppliers, and reminded everyone what the Fletcher name had always stood for: integrity, quality work, and loyalty to the people who made success possible. Bethany called me in February, just after her 20th birthday. I'm changing my last name back to my birth father's name, she told me. I can't keep carrying hers, not after everything she did. What about your college fund? I talked to Dad's estate attorney. Turns out I have my own trust fund from Dad's will, separate from anything Mom controlled. I'm not dependent on her anymore. I can tell the truth now. She did. Bethany gave a formal statement to prosecutors detailing everything she'd overheard, every suspicious behavior, every moment when Vivian had isolated our father or manipulated his medication schedule. Her testimony would be crucial at trial. The trial began in May 2026, 7 months after my father's death. I attended every day, sitting in the front row, watching Vivian's defense attorney try desperately to paint her as a loving wife who'd been misunderstood and maligned. The prosecution methodically destroyed that narrative. They played the audio recordings in their entirety. They brought in my father's doctors to testify about his cognitive state and how the medications he was supposedly taking would have affected his judgment. They presented evidence of the forged signatures, the conspiracy with Timmons, the plan to liquidate the company. They called employees who testified about Vivian's controlling behavior and my father's growing withdrawal and confusion during his final months. They brought in forensic accountants who'd traced Vivian's financial planning and found she'd already set up offshore accounts to hide the money from the planned sale of Fletcher Construction. And finally, they called Bethany. My sister was terrified walking up to that witness stand, but once she started talking, her voice grew stronger. She detailed the phone conversation she'd overheard, Vivian's laughter about manipulating a doped-up old man, the casual cruelty with which she discussed our father's impending death. When the defense attorney tried to suggest Bethany was lying to protect me, she looked him directly in the eye and said, "My mother destroyed everything my stepfather built and tried to steal my brother's inheritance. The only person I'm protecting is the truth." The jury deliberated for 6 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges. conspiracy to commit fraud, elder abuse, forgery, and criminally negligent homicide. Vivian's face showed no emotion as the verdicts were read, but her hands were shaking so badly she had to grip the defense table to steady herself. Sentencing was scheduled for 3 weeks later. At the sentencing hearing, I was allowed to give a victim impact statement. I stood in front of the court and talked about my father, about the man he'd been before Vivian entered his life, about his generosity, his work ethic, his love for his family and his company, about how he'd been systematically isolated, manipulated, and ultimately killed by someone who saw him as nothing more than a means to financial gain. "She didn't just steal from me," I said, my voice steady despite the rage burning in my chest. "She stole my father's final months. She stole his dignity, his autonomy, his ability to die peacefully surrounded by people who actually loved him. She turned his death into a business transaction, and she did it all with a smile on her face while pretending to be the devoted wife. That kind of calculated cruelty deserves the harshest possible punishment." Judge Livingstone sentenced Vivian to 18 years in prison, the maximum allowed under the sentencing guidelines. With good behavior, she'd be eligible for parole in 12 years, by which time she'd be 53 years old, her youth and opportunities gone, her reputation permanently destroyed. Gerald Timmons received 8 years for his role in the conspiracy. He was disbarred and will never practice law again. Bethany and I stood outside the courthouse after sentencing, watching Vivian be led away in handcuffs for what would likely be the last time we'd ever see her. "Is it wrong that I don't feel anything?" Bethany asked. "Not even satisfaction?" "No. She's a stranger who wore your mother's face. You don't owe her grief. Dad would be proud of you, for fighting for his legacy. He'd be proud of both of us. You're the one who got the evidence that made all this possible." Fletcher Construction had its best year on record in 2026. We landed several major contracts, expanded into a 4th state, and increased our workforce by 30%. Every success felt like vindication, proof that my father's vision and values could outlive the person who'd tried to destroy them. I kept the letter he'd written me, the one promising the company would be mine, framed in my office. Not as a trophy, but as a reminder of what matters: integrity, family, and the courage to fight for what's right, even when the system seems stacked against you. A year after Vivian's sentencing, I received a letter from her in prison. I almost threw it away without reading, but curiosity got the better of me. The letter was 2 pages of self-justification and blame-shifting. She claimed she'd loved my father, that I'd misunderstood her intentions, that the recordings had been taken out of context. She never once admitted what she'd actually done or apologized for the pain she'd caused. She ended with a request that I come visit her, that we heal this rift for Bethany's sake. I wrote one sentence in response. "You stole my father's final months and tried to destroy his legacy. I owe you nothing." I never heard from her again. Sometimes people ask me if I regret how hard I fought, if the emotional toll was worth it. I tell them about standing in that church basement, hearing my entire inheritance dismissed in a single sentence, feeling the rage and betrayal that comes from being systematically erased from your own family's story. And then I tell them about walking into Fletcher Construction every morning, seeing my father's name still on the building, knowing that his life's work is safe and thriving. The fight was worth every moment. Justice wasn't just about the will or the money, or even the criminal convictions. Justice was proving that some things, integrity, truth, family legacy, are worth fighting for no matter the cost. My father built Fletcher Construction to outlast him, to give me something solid and real to build my own life on. Vivian tried to steal that future, but she failed. That's the legacy that matters. Not what she tried to take, but what she couldn't destroy. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.